There is a question that historians and ordinary people alike keep coming back to when they study the years before the Civil War. And it is this: was the war inevitable? Was there a point at which a different decision, by a different person, in a different direction, could have changed the outcome? Was the catastrophe written into the structure of American society from the beginning? Slavery and democracy living together in the same republic until one had to destroy the other. Or was it a contingent thing, something that happened because specific people made specific choices at specific moments when other choices were available? Historians disagree about this, as historians disagree about almost everything. But there is remarkable consensus on one narrower point. If there was a moment when the war could have been prevented, or at least shortened, or at least fought under conditions more favorable to a quick Union victory, that moment was the presidency of James Buchanan, from 1857 to 1861, and it was squandered so completely, so systematically, and with such apparent deliberateness that Buchanan has come to occupy a unique place in the American historical imagination. He is not simply a bad president. Bad presidents are common. They are incapable, or corrupt, or lazy, or unlucky. Buchanan was none of these things. He was experienced, more experienced, going into the presidency than almost any man who had ever held the office. He was intelligent, genuinely so, a trained lawyer with a sharp analytical mind. He was hard-working, obsessively, sometimes miserably so, a man who had no family, no hobbies, almost no life outside of politics and work. He was also, in the 4 years of his presidency, a catastrophe of a magnitude that goes beyond failure into something that requires a different word entirely. He watched the country come apart and found constitutional reasons to do nothing. He allowed the southern states to arm themselves for rebellion on the federal government's own dime, while insisting that he had no legal authority to stop them. He handed his successor a military situation so compromised that the war, when it came, was bloodier and longer than it needed to be. And then he spent the rest of his life writing a memoir insisting that he had been right about everything. This is James Buchanan, the most experienced man ever to become president. The man who turned experience into paralysis and paralysis into catastrophe. He was born in 1791 in a log cabin in Cove Gap, Pennsylvania, a detail his political biography always emphasized, connecting him to the frontier authenticity that American voters valued. His father was an Irish immigrant who had built a successful trading post and then a farm. James was the second of 11 children, raised in a household that valued hard work, ambition, and the Presbyterian faith with equal seriousness. He was, from early childhood, exceptionally bright. He went to Dickinson College in Pennsylvania, where he graduated in 1809 at the top of his class, having initially been expelled for bad behavior, carousing, neglecting his studies, being in general the kind of brilliant, undisciplined young man that educational institutions of every era find maddening, and then reinstated after appealing to the faculty with a combination of genuine remorse and political skill that foreshadowed the career to come. He read law, was admitted to the Pennsylvania bar in 1812, and very quickly established himself as one of the best trial lawyers in the state. He was good at argument, good at preparation, good at the theatrical performance that effective courtroom advocacy requires. He made a great deal of money quite young. He could have had a very comfortable life as a wealthy Pennsylvania lawyer and never entered politics at all. But politics was what he wanted. He was elected to the Pennsylvania legislature in 1814, served 2 terms, and then won a seat in the United States House of Representatives in 1820. He served 5 terms in the House, through the entire era of the dissolution of the old Federalist and Democratic Republican parties and the emergence of the new Jacksonian Democratic coalition. Then the Senate, elected in 1834, served until 1845. Then minister to Russia under President Polk, a diplomatic posting that he handled competently, if not brilliantly. Then Secretary of State under Polk, from 1845 to 1849, where he was central to the negotiation of the Oregon Treaty with Britain and to the management of the Mexican-American War's diplomatic dimensions. Then minister to Britain under Pierce, from 1853 to 1856, where, crucially, he was safely out of the country during the entire Kansas-Nebraska disaster and could keep his hands clean. By 1856, when the Democrats needed a candidate, James Buchanan had 40 years of continuous public service behind him. He had held more significant offices than almost any American politician alive. He had negotiated treaties, managed wars, represented his country in foreign capitals. He was 65 years old, never married, with no family to distract him, no obligations outside of his work. He had been preparing for the presidency, in one way or another, for most of his adult life. He had run for the nomination in 1844, in 1848, in 1852, losing each time to someone with better luck or better timing. In 1856, it finally came. He had waited so long. He had worked so hard. He had sacrificed so much. And then he wasted it. Before we get to the presidency, there is something about Buchanan's personal life that has attracted considerable historical attention and that is worth addressing directly, because it tells us something about the man and about the era he lived in. James Buchanan never married. He was, as far as the record shows, the only bachelor to serve as President of the United States. He lived for many years in Washington with his close friend and Senate colleague William Rufus Devane King of Alabama. So close that Andrew Jackson, not a man given to delicacy, called them Miss Nancy and Aunt Fancy, and that others in Washington referred to King as Buchanan's better half, or as his wife. When King died in 1853, Buchanan wrote to a mutual friend that he had lost the companion of his old age, that he had no one to whom he could tell what was on his mind, that he was alone in a way he had not been before. Whether this relationship was romantic or sexual, or simply the deep emotional bond between two men of a culture that permitted such bonds without necessarily sexualizing them, this is not something the historical record resolves definitively. It has been debated. It will probably always be debated. What is not debatable is that it was the most significant personal relationship of Buchanan's adult life, and that after King's death, he was in a meaningful sense alone for the rest of it. There was also, early in his life, a romantic engagement that ended in a way that affected him deeply. He had been engaged to a young woman named Anne Coleman, the daughter of a wealthy Pennsylvania iron manufacturer, in 1819. The engagement broke off under circumstances that have never been fully explained. Apparently after a quarrel, possibly after rumors about Buchanan's behavior or motives reached her. Anne Coleman died shortly afterward, at 23, from what her family called hysterical convulsions, and what may have been a suicide, though this has never been confirmed. Her family refused to allow Buchanan to attend the funeral. He carried this loss for the rest of his life. He never became engaged again. He never, as far as the record shows, seriously courted another woman. Whether he was protecting himself from another such loss, or whether his emotional and romantic life was oriented entirely differently, is another question the record doesn't resolve. What the record does show is a man who was, in some profound way, emotionally self-contained, capable of warmth and friendship, capable of the political relationships that his career required, but fundamentally alone and not entirely unhappy about it. He had his work. He had his ambitions. He had his convictions. These things organized his life. The convictions, when applied to the presidency, would be catastrophic. Buchanan's political philosophy was, like Pierce's, rooted in the Jacksonian democratic tradition. But where Pierce had inherited it from his father's revolutionary generation, Buchanan had built it himself through 40 years of careful, lawyerly thinking. He was a constitutionalist in the deepest sense. He believed that the Constitution was the supreme law, that it meant what it said, that the role of the federal government was strictly limited by its text, and that any expansion of federal power beyond what the text clearly permitted was dangerous and wrong. This framework produced, in almost every political context of the 1830s, 1840s, and early 1850s, entirely reasonable conclusions. The federal government should not build internal improvements at federal expense without clear constitutional authority. The federal government should not charter a national bank. The federal government should not impose high protective tariffs that benefited one region at the expense of another. These were defensible positions, rooted in genuine principles. But the framework had a fatal weakness, which the 1850s exposed with brutal clarity. It said nothing about what to do when the Constitution was being used to protect an institution, slavery, that was destroying the Republic. It said nothing about what to do when states claimed constitutional protection for activities that were corroding the foundations of democratic governance. It said nothing about what to do when the literal text, applied with rigorous consistency, produced outcomes that a reasonable person could see were catastrophic. Buchanan's constitutionalism was a tool for an era of normal politics. In the abnormal politics of the late 1850s, it became a mechanism for paralysis. It gave him a principled reason to do nothing at every moment when doing something was required. And Buchanan was extraordinarily good at finding principled reasons to do nothing. The first disaster of the Buchanan presidency came before he had been in office 2 days, and it was a disaster he had helped to manufacture. The Dred Scott case had been working its way through the federal courts since 1846. Dred Scott was an enslaved man who had lived for several years with his enslaver in Illinois, a free state, and in the Wisconsin Territory, north of the Missouri Compromise line, where slavery was prohibited. Scott argued that his residence in free territory had made him free, and that he could not be re-enslaved when he returned to Missouri. The case reached the Supreme Court, and the court's ruling was handed down on March 6, 1857, 2 days after Buchanan's inauguration. Before the ruling was announced, Buchanan had been in correspondence with 2 Supreme Court justices, John Catron of Tennessee and Robert Greer of Pennsylvania, pressing them, in letters that were flatly improper by any standard of judicial ethics, to issue a broad ruling rather than a narrow one. He wanted the court to settle the slavery question definitively, to rule not just on Scott's specific situation, but on the broader constitutional status of slavery in the territories. He knew roughly what the ruling would be. He had been told, and knowing what the ruling would be, he referenced it in his inaugural address, suggesting that the territorial slavery question was a judicial matter that would be speedily and finally settled by the Supreme Court, and that he, like all good Americans, would cheerfully submit to whatever the court decided. He was, in effect, previewing the ruling in his inaugural address while pretending he didn't know what it would say. The Dred Scott ruling, written by Chief Justice Roger Taney, was one of the most sweeping and destructive judicial decisions in American history. It ruled that Dred Scott could not bring suit in federal court because he was not a citizen, and not merely because he was enslaved, but because he was black, and Taney argued that no black person, whether enslaved or free, had ever been intended by the founders to be a citizen of the United States. Black people were, in Taney's formulation, so far below the consideration of the founders that they had no rights which white men were bound to respect. Further, Taney ruled that the Missouri Compromise had been unconstitutional from the beginning, that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories because enslaved people were property, and the Fifth Amendment protected citizens from being deprived of their property without due process of law. The federal government could not deprive a slaveholder of his property simply because he traveled into a certain territory. This was everything the Southern slave power had been demanding for 30 years, handed to them by the Supreme Court in a single ruling. The North exploded. The Dred Scott decision did for the Republican Party in 1857 what the Fugitive Slave Act had done in 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act had done in 1854. It radicalized people who had been trying to stay moderate. It converted passive anti-slavery sentiment into active political fury. And it demonstrated, to anyone paying attention, that the legal and political structures of the Republic were being systematically bent to the service of the slave power. Buchanan believed he had solved the problem. He had been president for 2 days. Kansas was still bleeding. The territorial mess that Pierce had failed to resolve had, if anything, gotten worse during the last year of his administration and continued to deteriorate under Buchanan's. There were now 2 governments, 2 constitutions, 2 claims to legitimate authority in the territory, and armed partisans on both sides willing to kill for their side's right to prevail. The pro-slavery government, headquartered at Lecompton, produced a constitution, the Lecompton Constitution, that would have made Kansas a slave state. The Constitution was put to a referendum, but in a referendum so structured that voters could only choose between accepting the Constitution with slavery protections intact or accepting it without slavery's explicit protections, but with the enslaved people already in Kansas guaranteed their status. There was no option to simply reject the Constitution. The Free Soil majority in Kansas boycotted the referendum as a farce. The Constitution passed with a tiny fraction of eligible voters participating. Buchanan supported the Lecompton Constitution. He sent it to Congress recommending Kansas's admission as a slave state under its terms. This was too much even for Stephen Douglas, the architect of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the author of Popular Sovereignty, the man who had done more than anyone except Buchanan himself to enable the pro-slavery agenda in the territories. Douglas recognized the Lecompton Constitution for what it was, a fraud. Popular sovereignty meant that the actual settlers of a territory decided its institutions. The Lecompton Constitution had been approved by a rigged process that systematically excluded the actual majority of Kansas settlers. Supporting it wasn't popular sovereignty. It was a grotesque parody of it. Douglas broke with Buchanan over Lecompton. The Democratic Party began to fracture. Buchanan, furious, used every patronage weapon available to him to punish Douglas and his allies, denying federal appointments, withdrawing contracts, pressuring local Democratic organizations to oppose senators and congressmen who voted against Lecompton. It was politically brutal and politically stupid. The Democrats lost significant ground in the 1858 midterm elections. The Republican Party, barely 4 years old, won control of the House of Representatives. The South was watching all of this and drawing conclusions. The slave states were losing ground politically. The demographic arithmetic was moving against them. The Republican Party was growing. Time was running out for the slave power's ability to protect itself through normal political means. Meanwhile, something else happened in 1859 that changed the temperature of the entire country in ways that made everything that followed feel almost predetermined. John Brown had been in Kansas in 1856, leading the Pottawatomie Massacre. He had survived, evaded capture, and continued his career as a radical anti-slavery militant with a growing conviction that only direct violent action could end slavery. He believed God had called him to be the instrument of slavery's destruction. He was, by most clinical assessments, a deeply dangerous man, not in the way of a cynical opportunist, but in the way of someone who is absolutely certain of his divine mission and will follow it wherever it leads. In October 1859, Brown led a small armed force, fewer than 24 men, black and white, on a raid on the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His plan was to seize the weapons in the armory and use them to arm a slave revolt that would spread across the South, collapsing the system from within. The raid lasted less than 2 days. Brown and his men took the armory and seized several hostages. They waited for the slave revolt that never came. Federal and state forces, including a detachment of Marines commanded by Colonel Robert E. Lee, surrounded the armory and stormed it. Brown was wounded, captured, tried for treason against the state of Virginia, convicted, and hanged on December 2, 1859. The raid itself was a military failure. Its political consequences were enormous. In the North, Brown was mourned as a martyr. Emerson called him a new saint. Thoreau wrote a defense of his character that was one of the most passionate pieces of anti-slavery writing of the era. Bells were rung in northern cities on the day of his execution. The image of Brown, old, bearded, serene as he was led to the gallows, became one of the most powerful symbols of the anti-slavery movement. In the South, the reaction was terror. Harper's Ferry confirmed every paranoid fantasy about Northern abolitionism that Southern politicians had been cultivating for decades. The North was coming for them. The North was arming slave revolts. The The North would destroy their society, their safety, their lives. Every Southern Democrat who had been arguing for compromise and caution now had to answer for Harper's Ferry. Every moderate position became untenable. The Democratic Party convention in April 1860 in Charleston, South Carolina, fell apart completely. The Northern Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas on a platform that declined to explicitly guarantee slavery in the territories. The Southern Democrats walked out and nominated their own candidate, John Breckinridge of Kentucky, on a platform demanding federal protection of slavery everywhere. The party that had held the country together for 30 years, the Democratic coalition that stretched from New England to the Gulf of Mexico, the coalition that both Pierce and Buchanan had devoted their careers to maintaining, split in half. The Republican Party nominated Abraham Lincoln of Illinois, a one-term former congressman who was almost unknown nationally, on a platform of no slavery in the territories. Lincoln won. He won without a single Southern electoral vote, with barely 100,000 votes from the slave states, running against 3 opponents instead of 1. He won because the Northern population had grown large enough, and Northern opinion had shifted decisively enough, that a purely Northern candidate with no Southern support whatsoever could win the presidency. The South had been warning for years that a Republican president would mean secession. They had not been bluffing. Between Lincoln's election in Northern 1860 and his inauguration in March 1861, the United States came apart. South Carolina seceded in December 1860. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed in January and February 1861. The Confederate States of America was formally established in February, with Jefferson Davis as its president, before Lincoln had taken the oath of office. All of this happened on James Buchanan's watch. During the 4 months between Lincoln's election and Lincoln's inauguration, the sitting president of the United States was James Buchanan. What he did, or rather, what he chose not to do, during those 4 months is the defining fact of his presidency, and the reason historians have ranked him at or near the very bottom of every presidential assessment for over a century. His annual message to Congress in December 1860 is one of the most extraordinary documents in American political history. It managed to simultaneously denounce secession as unconstitutional, which was legally correct, and deny that the federal government had any power to prevent it, which was legally incoherent. In Buchanan's reading, secession was illegal, but the Constitution gave the president no authority to use military force to prevent it, and Congress had passed no law authorizing such force, and therefore he could do nothing. He blamed the crisis on the Northern states. Specifically, he blamed the Northern states for their failure to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, for harboring anti-slavery agitators, for creating the climate of hostility that had pushed the South to this point. The South was reacting, in Buchanan's framing, to genuine provocations. The North had failed to honor its constitutional obligations. The crisis was Northern. This was, in November and December 1860, what the President of the United States was saying. He was not a Confederate. He was not trying to help the South win. He was, in his own mind, a neutral, a constitutionalist, a man who refused to let passion override principle. He was applying his legal framework to the crisis as honestly as he knew how. The framework was simply, completely, catastrophically wrong for the moment. What happened during those 4 months, while Buchanan was finding constitutional reasons to do nothing, was the systematic dismantling of the federal government's ability to respond to the rebellion when it came. Southern cabinet members, Buchanan's Secretary of War, John Floyd of Virginia, his Secretary of the Interior, Jacob Thompson of Mississippi, his Secretary of the Treasury, Howell Cobb of Georgia, used their positions to facilitate the Confederacy's preparation for war in ways that are, in retrospect, almost unbelievable. Floyd, as Secretary of War, approved the transfer of 115,000 muskets and rifles from Northern to Southern arsenals in the months before secession, effectively pre-positioning weapons where the Confederacy could seize them. He approved the dispatch of federal troops to remote frontier posts where they would be unavailable when needed in the East. He left coastal fortifications in the South critically undermanned. Thompson and Cobb managed federal finances and contracts in ways that depleted the northern capacity and redirected resources southward. Cobb, before he resigned, managed to leave the Treasury nearly empty. Buchanan knew about most of this. He allowed most of it to continue. He replaced his Southern cabinet members eventually, but gradually, partially, as they resigned on their own schedule to join the Confederacy rather than being fired for their sabotage. The exception, the one moment in the secession winter when Buchanan showed something like spine, was Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was a federal garrison in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. When South Carolina seceded in December 1860, the fort became a symbol, a piece of federal property inside Confederate territory, held by Union soldiers, representing the continued presence and authority of the government the Confederacy had just declared itself independent from. The garrison was commanded by Major Robert Anderson, who was himself a Kentuckian and a former slaveholder, as unlikely a hero as the moment could have produced. Anderson's garrison was small, lightly supplied, increasingly vulnerable as South Carolina forces built fortifications around the harbor. Buchanan wanted to reinforce the garrison. He sent a civilian ship, the Star of the West, with troops and supplies in January 1861. Confederate artillery fired on it before it could reach the fort. The Star of the West turned back. Buchanan did not respond militarily. He protested. He looked for legal options. He waited for Congress to act. Congress did not act, and the reinforcement of Fort Sumter, the decision that would fall to Lincoln, was left to a president who had no intention of starting a war 4 months after his term ended. There is something almost unbearably sad about the Fort Sumter episode because it shows Buchanan at the precise intersection of his conflicting impulses. He wanted to hold the fort, wanted to assert federal authority, wanted to do the thing that was obviously right. And then he retreated into the legal framework that told him he couldn't, and found reasons why the timing wasn't right, and waited, and the moment passed. This was the pattern of his presidency, played out in its most consequential iteration. See the right thing. Explain why the Constitution prevents it. Do nothing. Move on. Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4, 1861. Buchanan, sitting beside him on the platform, reportedly said to his successor, "If you are as happy in entering the White House as I shall feel on returning to Wheatland, you are a happy man indeed." Wheatland was his estate in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He wanted to go home. He had wanted to go home, it seems, almost from the beginning, not because he was lazy, but because the presidency had been a grinding, joyless labor of trying to hold together something that was pulling apart faster than he could patch it. He went back to Wheatland. He watched the war unfold from there. He watched Fort Sumter bombarded in April 1861. The garrison surrendered, and the country go to war. He watched Lincoln do, in the first weeks of the war, things that Buchanan had insisted were constitutionally impossible: calling up militia, blockading southern ports, suspending habeas corpus, and he watched the country, or most of it, accept these measures as necessary. He began writing his memoir, Mr. Buchanan's Administration on the Eve of the Rebellion, published in 1866. It is a remarkable document, a sustained, detailed, carefully argued defense of every decision he had made, every failure of action he had presided over, every constitutional scruple he had honored while the country burned. He was not ashamed. He was not apologetic. He was convinced that history would vindicate him. History did not vindicate him. What is it about Buchanan that made his failure so complete? The obvious answer, the one that most historians settle on eventually, is the combination of his constitutionalism and his Southern sympathies. He had spent 40 years in Democratic politics, building a coalition that required Northern deference to Southern demands. He had absorbed the Southern argument about constitutional rights and federal overreach until it had become genuinely, personally his. He didn't just calculate that supporting the South was politically necessary. He believed it was right. But there's something else, something harder to name, that matters too. Buchanan was a man who had spent his entire adult life in the world of normal politics, the world of negotiation, compromise, coalition building, the trading of benefits and concessions that makes democratic governance function. He was extraordinarily good at this world. He had spent 40 years mastering it. And what the late 1850s confronted him with was a situation that was no longer normal politics. It was a moral and constitutional crisis that could not be resolved by negotiation and compromise, because one side, the slave power, had decided that its interests were non-negotiable, and that it would accept nothing less than permanent, constitutionally protected domination of the Republic's institutions. In normal politics, you find the deal, you find the price, you find the formula that everyone can live with. Buchanan kept looking for the deal on slavery, even as it became clearer and clearer that no deal was available. Because the other party to the negotiation was preparing for war, not compromise. He couldn't update. He couldn't shift from the politician's mode, in which every problem has a political solution, to the leader's mode, in which some problems require you to draw a line and defend it with everything you have. Pierce had the same failure, but Pierce was younger, less experienced, overwhelmed by personal tragedy. Buchanan had no excuse of inexperience. He was the most experienced man in the country. He simply could not make the adjustment that the moment demanded. There is a small, terrible irony in Buchanan's life that deserves mention. He had spent his presidency trying to preserve the Democratic coalition, the North-South alliance that had governed the country for a generation. He had sacrificed everything to it. His relationship with Douglas, his standing with Northern Democrats, his historical reputation. He had given the slave power everything it wanted, hoping that appeasement would satisfy it and preserve the Union. The slave power was not satisfied. It left anyway. The Southern states that he had worked so hard to accommodate seceded the moment a Republican won the presidency, with no further consideration for the Northern Democrats who had given them everything they asked for. The coalition that Buchanan had sacrificed so much to maintain dissolved the moment the South decided it no longer served their purposes. He had paid the price. He had gotten nothing for it. This is the tragedy of appeasement in its purest form. The appeaser gives everything, the aggressors take it, and then they move on, because what they wanted was never really appeasable. The demands were a process, not a destination, and the destination was always more power, not the resolution of grievances. Buchanan couldn't see this while it was happening. Most people can't. The sunk costs accumulate. Each concession is justified by the previous concession, because admitting that the whole strategy was wrong from the beginning is psychologically unbearable for someone who has organized his entire political life around it. He died in 1868 at 77 of pneumonia at Wheatland. His last public statement, made shortly before he died, was that history would vindicate him. He had been saying variations of this for 7 years. History has not vindicated him. James Buchanan is ranked last, or nearly last, in virtually every serious assessment of American presidents. The competition for this distinction is fierce. He is consistently below Pierce, below Andrew Johnson, sometimes below Warren Harding, but Buchanan holds his place at the bottom with a consistency that reflects the depth of the judgment historians have rendered. What makes his failure distinctively terrible, rather than simply terrible, is the combination of his capacity and his context. He was not an accidental president. He was not a mediocrity who stumbled into the job. He was a man who had prepared for decades, who brought genuine ability and genuine intelligence to the office, who operated with a clear sense of his own principles and priorities. And he used all of that capacity to do the wrong things. The preparation produced confidence in a framework that was wrong. The intelligence produced sophisticated arguments for indefensible positions. The clarity of his principles produced rigidity at the moments when flexibility was required. He handed Lincoln a country with its southern forts stripped of weapons, its treasury depleted, its army scattered, its southern states in open rebellion. He handed Lincoln a military situation so compromised that the war, when it came, would last 4 years and kill 600,000 people, rather than being resolved in months by an adequately prepared federal response. And then he went to Wheatland and wrote a book explaining that he had done everything correctly. There is one more thing worth saying about Buchanan, and it's the thing that closes the circle of the entire antebellum period. The period that begins with Fillmore, runs through Pierce, and ends with Buchanan. All three of these men believed in the Union. All three of them made the preservation of the Union the organizing principle of their political lives. All three of them understood the threat that slavery posed to the Union. They were not stupid men. They could read the newspapers. They could see what was happening. And all three of them, when the moment came to actually defend the Union against that threat, found reasons not to. Fillmore signed the Fugitive Slave Act because the Union required appeasement of the South. Pierce signed the Kansas-Nebraska Act because the Union required keeping the Democratic coalition together. Buchanan did nothing during the secession winter because the Union, in his reading, required that he not exceed his constitutional authority. The Union that all three of them were trying to preserve did not survive their efforts. It survived the war that their failures made inevitable, but it survived as a different thing, scarred, transformed, reconstructed. The country that emerged from the Civil War was not the country that Fillmore or Pierce or Buchanan had been trying to protect. What they had been protecting, without acknowledging it, was not the Union in any meaningful sense. They had been protecting the political arrangements that made the Union tolerable to the slave power. They had been protecting the balance of power that allowed one part of the country to hold 3 million human beings in bondage while the other part looked away. They had called this the Union, and they had called their willingness to maintain it at any cost patriotism. It was not patriotism. It was complicity. Sophisticated, principled, deeply sincere complicity. But complicity nonetheless. James Buchanan was the last and the worst of this series. The most experienced, the most prepared, the most certain of his own correctness. The man who watched the country come apart from the best possible vantage point, with more information, more experience, more institutional power than anyone alive, and did nothing. He called it constitutional. The soldiers who died at Antietam and Gettysburg and Chickamauga because the rebellion was allowed to grow and prepare and arm itself during those 4 months called it something else. James Buchanan, the 15th President of the United States, the man who watched America burn and called it constitutional.